Welcome to The Game. This is the show where we go play by play, analyzing the game of politics. We have an exciting lineup of topics today. We're going to be starting off with the clash between Fed Chairman Jerome Powell and President Donald Trump over interest rates. Who is correct when it comes to the strategy and the direction that those interest rates should go? Then we'll break down the conversation around tariffs and trade policies. Who's paying the price and who's benefiting when it comes to these negotiations? We're also going to be looking at American homebuyers and the struggles they're facing. Is this continuing to be part of the American dream, or will it continue to be a struggle towards the American dream? Lastly, we're also going to be looking at international news coming out of Israel, Bolivia, and Venezuela, and what's going on in the region there. Here to talk about these topics in studio, I have Raul Mas. Raul Mas is a political analyst and economics analyst. He's worked throughout his whole career in banking. We also have Frank Ali coming from Tegucigalpa, Honduras. He is a conservative analyst and also the international secretary of the Patriots Network. Raul, Frank, thank you guys for being here.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Let's kick it off. Again, that clash, that battle between Fed Chair and President Donald Trump. It's a high-stakes battle. And this Friday, tomorrow, Jerome Powell will be at the annual retreat, I believe they might call it.
Yeah, they have a name for it. They do it every year. It's kind of like their annual soiree where they go to the nice, cool mountains in Jackson Hole and talk about, they have a lot of speakers come in. They talk about policies, and it's like a conference that they do every year.
And it's a big conference which many folks are looking at that believe that there is a possibility that he will give a preview of what to expect in September. Again, this has been something that Donald Trump has been calling for the Fed Chair and the Federal Reserve in general to lower interest rates. Raul, I want to start with you. What is your expectation coming out of this meeting? Is there a chance that the Fed Chair, that Jerome Powell, might change his direction? He stood pretty firm on his position, even though the president has called for him to look at what he calls the data.
Right.
What are your expectations here?
Look, I mean, he's been very coy about which way he wants. I shouldn't say coy. He's been reluctant to signal whether he's going to cut or not, or continue to keep rates at a rather elevated fashion. He keeps telling us time and time again that the reason for that is that he is concerned that all this sort of mishmash over the tariffs, may in fact result in higher prices for the consumers and could possibly cause a spike up in inflation, right? And you have to understand that the Fed's mission is really twofold. Number one, to maintain price stability, to control inflation. But at the same time, they also have the objective of, trying to keep as many people employed as they possibly can. So right now, it's a very delicate balancing act because, his fear is that if we start to see prices on a lot of consumer goods starting to finally hit in the supermarket, they don't want to sort of be loosening things right now and then have to jump back in and tighten them again because all of a sudden we have an inflationary spiral. I think, quite frankly, the risks of that are low. I'm happy to sort of go into the details why, but that's his position right now. And it has a certain amount of merit to it because if you think about it, when this whole tariff battle began back in April, right? What had actually happened at the beginning of the year is a lot of importers kind of anticipating that there was going to be this turmoil. They bought a bunch of stuff into the U.S. They stocked
ahead
up.
Of time.
Yeah, the warehouses are stocked to the gills, right? So when you go, I do the shopping in my family, right? I'm the guy who goes to the supermarket, who goes to, Costco, all that good stuff. I haven't really seen like a dramatic increase in prices. In fact, I've seen some of the stuff go down, right? I mean, we've seen some egg prices have kind of stabilized. Milk has gone down a little bit, things like that. But the fear is that, now that those warehouse inventories are starting to deplete, you're really going to begin to see the effects of, 15, 20, 25% tariffs being kicked in, and you're going to see those importers pass those costs along to the consumers.
And that's I would say the main point that many folks, critics of the president's position, have said is that the cost will be taken to the consumer. We'll talk a little bit about trade and tariffs a little bit in our second segment. But I wanted to ask you, so you gave a little bit of Jerome Powell's position. What is President Trump thinking in all this? I mean, he has a reason behind his call for interest rates to come down. What would you say is that position?
Yeah, well, I think, if you look at the data, and again, he's also criticized the data itself, right? He just fired a senior economist because, and I think correctly, I mean, the economic numbers that were being given, they're being collected in a very outdated fashion. They're having to revise them month after month. I think there really has to be a better way to actually analyze the economy. But the data that we've seen so far, inflation is kind of under control, right? The job numbers are decent. I mean, we're not seeing enormous economic growth yet, okay? But it's improving, and it's going to take some time for all those plants and all those things to come onto the production line. But I think, what the president is saying is, look, I want to jumpstart this economy, and so long as we have interest rates as high as they are, I'm sort of fighting with one hand tied behind my back because, as you well mentioned, it's very difficult with mortgage rates as high as they are. For example, I'm basically locked into my house. I mean, I'm at a very low interest rate that I got years ago, and if I were to sell now, where do I go? I mean, yeah, my house is appreciated enormously, but the mortgage is going to cost me, twice as much. Even if I get into a smaller unit, whatever, I'm going to be paying a heck of a lot more. Meantime, young people are looking to get into homes, and they can't because people like myself are not willing to move because we got nowhere to go, and the interest rates are really high, and we don't want to have to pay twice as much for a much smaller unit. Even if we did want to move, right? So. And, the real estate market is a huge part of the U.S. economy, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that market right now, particularly for residential homes, the condo prices here in Miami, have actually stabilized or, actually going down in many cases because, people can't sell the units because the interest rates are too high. And at the same time, they're getting whacked with increasing, maintenance fees and stuff because of, the building that collapsed a couple of years ago up here in Miami. Surfside, now they got to inspect the buildings, the condos more often.
The assessments are going up and it's costing owners a lot.
Right. So a lot of these people that are in older condominiums now, not only are they paying their mortgage fees, but now they're getting assessed because you have to inspect these buildings now and you have to make repairs so we don't have another Surfside.
Do you believe the rumor has been that the president, along with his staffers, have been looking at possibly replacing Jerome Powell? He's been very hesitant to do that. In other areas, he's very, very quick to either let go of former staffers that were tied to the Biden administration, right? He's famously known as the president who, with the term, you're fired. Right. So 2 questions. Why has he been hesitant? Why not fire Jerome Powell the moment, he sort of didn't do what he wanted? But do you think now that he could? Maybe he didn't do it at the beginning. Will he do it later on?
No, I don't think he will. And I think he's been wise to not do it. I think Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, basically counseled him correctly that it would be a bad move to fire the Fed chairman. It's never been done. And quite frankly, I don't think the president has a leg to stand on. And let me explain that. The Federal Reserve is a creation of Congress, right? And when they created the Federal Reserve, they specifically designed it to have an independent, Fed chairman. Yes, he's appointed by the president, okay? But, you can't just dismiss him. He's there for his entire term. And I think if he were to fire him, Jerome Powell has actually indicated that he would take him to court. And I think Jerome Powell, quite frankly, would win, okay? And I don't think that would look very good for the president. Now, the reason I think he would win is because there was a Supreme Court decision a couple of months back. I forget the details of it. But it was one of these cases where Trump had fired some officials at a quote-unquote independent federal agency. And people were saying, well, it's an independent agency. They can't do that. He went ahead and fired him. And when it got to the Supreme Court blessed it and said, yeah, he can do that, okay? But in that decision, there's a paragraph in there where the Supreme Court made the decision between these particular federal agencies and actually referred to the central bank. And the Federal Reserve that we have today is actually sort of the third central bank that we've had in America's history. There was one, right after the revolution. There was a second central bank that fizzled out, I think, before the beginning of the Civil War, and then this one that was created by Congress at the beginning of the 20th century. So the Supreme Court indicated in that ruling that the Federal Reserve is a whole different ball of wax because it was created by Congress. It was designed to be independent. It has a history, going back to the American Revolution. And I think if they were to get into a battle at the Supreme Court, I don't think the president would win that one.
Very difficult. Like you said, it's never been done before. Frank, I want to go to you. The reality is there's the saying that says you're only as good as your last win. The president did have the one big beautiful bill. A lot of measures there focus on taxes. The number one issue during the campaign trail and currently in polling shows that is the topic of the economy. And interesting enough, when you talk to voters, when you talk to citizens, many times it's sometimes what they feel. It's perception, right? They're not necessarily sometimes looking at the stock market or looking at the rate. It's just sort of how they feel and what they're hearing. And the reality is there is this battle, and what we've heard a little bit from Raul is the battle will continue, right? There is the Fed chair, an area which he can stand on, but President Trump continues to say there needs to be movement. If there isn't movement, how do you picture this works out for Trump? Is this something where he's just going to have to pivot, sort of leave it alone? Will he continue to fight it? What's going to be his message to voters?
Well, first of all, I'm 100% on agreement with everything Raul said on technical economic standpoint. Obviously, I'm not an economist. I'm not an expert on it. But from what I know, it's 100% on point what he said on every issue. But now we go to the political side, and we know Trump. We know who is the president. He's not the one to be known to stand down from a fight. So, of course, he will fight too late Powell on this, like he calls them, obviously, because he's seen progression on his agenda. Everybody called him crazy. Everybody called him. I remember the Democrats at the beginning were like, oh, look, Trump is in power only 30 days or 60 days. And now prices of eggs have gone to the roof. I mean, but he did inherit. People need to remember this, and that's why sometimes I tell my friends in the Democratic Party they have amnesia. He didn't inherit a record high inflation, from a 40-year record high inflation, one of the also biggest record housing prices in the history of the U.S. He inherited two wars ongoing that he did not start in his term, were started by Biden, and one of the biggest immigration crises in history of the United States. All that being battled at the same time as a new president, obviously is going to have an impact. But now, advance 6, 7, 8 months later, and President Trump is already delivering on economic issues, on immigration issues, on trying to bring peace to the world. Look at the inflation. Raul has said it. It's going down. It's been low. It has good standing on. That's why Trump is pressuring Federal Reserve, too late Powell, to reduce inflation, to reduce interest rates because of the reduction of inflation. Obviously, we've seen a lot of revenue coming in by these tariffs that have been imposed internationally, and we haven't seen the impact in the groceries or impacting growth on the consumer. And you have a 40-year record high of confidence of small business in their government. So I think in the end, Trump has been consistent on what he does. The thing is, if you look at the records, Trump has been talking about tariffs for a long time. It's not a new thing. It's the thing he proposed 30, 40 years ago on talk shows. It's on public television when he was talking about how the U.S. can, pay its more than $3 trillion debt that it has right now. So in the end, I think Trump has been consistent. I think one person said it correctly, is that don't underestimate President Trump when he's trying to make a decision. So answering your question, we know President Trump will not back down from this fight. And I think what Jerome Powell has to do and understand is that he has to be on the same team of the president who's guiding the economic issues of the country. And if one of his plans at the beginning worked, I think if he will be on board, that would be a good thing. Obviously, this is not a political issue. This is a very technical economic issue. And I agree 100% with Raul on firing too late Powell. Would have been like firing Fauci in the pandemic. You
Hmm.
didn't really know the outcome. That's why they call Jerome is the Fauci of economics. It's because you really cannot foresee a good outcome if you do it during this time. It's never been done before. The markets could go into turmoil. Confidence could really be lacking on the Federal Reserve and how U.S. has managed its economic policy. So I think, yeah, it will be a very bad decision to fire him directly.
Hmm.
It will be seen as politics getting into something that has been shielded from politics for a very long time since its creation. So I think that would be a mistake. But that doesn't mean that I think that's what Trump and his team are doing is pressuring Jerome Powell into making decisions that they think will advance their economic agenda. And if we look at the numbers, in the end, like they say, facts don't care about your feelings. If you look at the numbers are in President Trump's direction. If they are in his direction, that means he's doing something right. And I think that's where the analysis has to come from part of Jerome Powell and all the people that are criticizing President Trump's economic agenda.
Yeah, and funny enough, Jerome Powell was nominated by President Trump during his first term. I think back then, folks wouldn't have predicted the clash that we're seeing now. Frank, real quickly before we move on to tariffs and to trade, something that I would be curious is the fact that Jerome Powell isn't moving. If anything, it might give the president and Republicans, who in 2026 will be fighting for control of the House and fighting control of the Senate, it might almost give them a quick talking point. I'm not saying voters are going to completely say, oh, yeah, it's Jerome Powell's fault, but it gives them a little bit of just a quick talking point to say, hey, we've been fighting for these interest rates changing, right? And while we've been fighting for that, we've passed the one big, beautiful bill. We've been focusing on the economy. Also, at the end of this year, the subsidies that are part of the Obama care, the Affordable Care Act, are going to expire. Another topic that's going to be front and center. Also, budget is coming up in September, so the topic of economy continues to be front and center now. Do you predict that will be the same in 2026 when we're in the midterms? Again, this big fight. Historically, a new president tends to lose their majority in that first midterm election. How much are these topics of the budget, of the economy, of tariffs, of what we're talking about now when it comes to interest rates? How much do you think this will play when it comes to the 2026 elections?
Well, remember, President Trump got elected. If you look at the polls of why they would choose a new president in 2024, most of it was economic issues. It wasn't foreign policy. It wasn't the wars going on. Obviously, it affects them and they know it. But mainly, it was economics. It was lacking of jobs, housing prices, grocery prices, record inflation. Basically,
Hmm.
that was the motive of all seven swing states voting for Donald Trump in the 2024 general election. So this is a big issue for him, not only as he had a great first term as president on economic issues. You got the minorities in his first term having record high income and also access to jobs. And you had a really good and stable inflation. You had a high job creation in every way possible. So I think the second term and his last term, he wants it to be a statement of I leave an economy better than I was handed on. Like I said, record inflation, record house pricing. I think that's what he wants this to be his legacy, and obviously he knows the time is ticking.
Hmm.
I think he's very surrounded by very smart people that are telling him that like a fast low reduction of interest rates may cause some damage, but also the same economic theme is telling him that they need to do it in a slow way.
Hmm.
I don't really know how it works on the technical side, but that's what I'm hearing from part of the economic team. So I think he wants this to be part of his plan. He knows that
Hmm.
the clock is ticking.
Yeah.
He doesn't have 8 years. He only has 4 years. So he needs to make this happen. And as we know, as we've been in government or we've been in politics before or public administration, the most slow things that people feel as a regular citizen and the most slowly thing that comes into effect are economic issues. When you fix something today, you will feel it somehow along the
Exactly.
way, but it's different from other type of topics, that you feel building a bridge or changing this type of policy. No, economic issues, you feel it along the way, and it's really changeable in time. So Trump knows this. His economic team knows this. So that's why he's trying to score big wins early on in
Yeah.
his mandate.
And one of the areas he's trying to create big wins is in the area of trade deals and in tariffs, which takes us really into the second part of the conversation here, which is the role and the impact of the trade deals that have been negotiated, likely to be implemented soon, but then also just the tariffs on many of those countries that have not yet been able to negotiate those rates. The reality is tariffs do have an impact on the economy. I mean, we even talk about, Raul mentioned some of the goals that importers started setting where they were filling the warehouses, and now that's going a little bit down, they're going to have to adjust. Possibly prices might go up. Walk us through, Raul, the reasoning of the president when it comes to trade deals and tariffs, because I believe sometimes he's driven different narratives. There's been the narrative of we need to protect U.S. manufacturing, U.S. jobs, right? And then some people have asked the questions, are we really going to bring back sort of steel factories, right? Are we going to bring back Nike factories? But then there's also been the subject and the narrative of fairness, of the different trade amounts that we have or deficits that we have with other countries. Where do you believe, or I'll add that the president also said that this is a way to bring in money, revenue to pay off the debt. He's even talked about checks that might go back to U.S. citizens, to taxpayers. How do you see it? What is the real thinking behind it?
There is an awful lot to sort of unravel in this whole sort of tariff conversation. Might have to do another segment on that, but because there really is a lot there. But just real quick, I'm glad that he referred to Jerome Powell as too late Powell.
Yeah.
And this kind of goes to the tariff issues as well. But you recall that a couple of years ago, when interest rates were when the inflation was on fire, right? I mean, especially after Russia invaded Ukraine. You remember Janet Yellen saying, "Oh, the inflation's only temporary." Well, inflation got to almost 10% at one point, right? And Jerome Powell waited too long back then to start raising interest rates, and that is why President Trump refers to him as too late Powell. He has a track record of being too late in terms of raising interest rates. And now what Trump is suggesting is that he's being too late in driving them lower. And I think, quite frankly, as our colleague alluded to, the evidence doesn't really show a spike in inflation right now. And if in the next couple of months, those inflation numbers continue to moderate, they're going to have to cut, between now and, hopefully year end, right? Because they can't continue to justify it. And Powell understands that he got it wrong the first time around on the way up. He should try and get it.
Has he said that? Has he sort of recognized it?
I think he has. I think he has. I think, they realize that they just sat on their hands for too long. I don't think he wants to repeat that mistake. He's gotten a lot of criticism for it because if they had started to tighten things a little bit sooner, then things wouldn't have spiraled out of control the way they did, quite frankly. And I think in retrospect, Monday morning quarterbacking is, always easy. But I think he realizes it was a mistake back then. And I think he's anxious to avoid that right now. But he continues to worry about the effect of these increased tariffs. Now, my view is, if you think about it, these things that you alluded to, yes, tariffs bring in and are bringing in an enormous amount of money into the U.S. Treasury. We need that money. Why? Because we have $36 trillion of debt right now, out of control. The GDP of the United States is around $25 trillion. And as a former banker, having, traveled all over the world, dealt with, countries in development, countries in financial crisis, typically when a country gets to a position where they've got 120, 130%, debt to GDP, that's when things go really bad. Now, the U.S. is in a different situation. Why? Because we are the U.S. of A. We are the reserve currency for the rest of the world. Everybody looks to us as the backstop for the rest of the world. Everybody still trusts that dollar. But it's getting increasingly more difficult to roll over our debt. There's it's not as easy as it was before. We're starting to see, I don't want to call them cracks, but we're starting to see some signs that there's not as much appetite for U.S. government debt anymore. It's crowding out private capital in the process because, investors can only take so much, bonds into their portfolio. They have a choice of government debt, corporate debt, but they can't just be taking the massive amounts of debt that are being issued by the government. They're getting a little bit of heartburn, to sort of put it in a way that perhaps people can understand. And I think what's going to happen with a lot of these importers, not everyone, but a lot of these companies are quite frankly just going to have to suck it up and absorb that increase in tariffs without passing along to the price to consumers. Why? Because it's a very competitive world. They don't want to lose market share. And think for a second about Nike. Okay, and Nike is kind of an extreme example. But, what does the cost of Air Jordans cost in these days?
I think $150.
$150? You know how much it costs to produce those Air Jordans?
Probably $50.
No,
maybe
try more like 10, 20 bucks, okay? In Vietnam, which I think is where they're produced. So what is a 15% tariff on a shoe that costs you $10 to, raw materials and production costs? You're talking what, $1.50, right?
Yeah.
I mean, on a $10
very
product,
minimal.
right? Let's say it's 30%. Let's say it's $3 on $10 or $6 on $26. You still have an enormous margin in those kinds of products. Not on everything, but in those kinds of products. I don't think Nike is going to be ceding their enormous market share to competitors. I think they'll absorb that cost. I think they'll look at other ways to reduce their operating expenses and be able to save consumers because they want to hold on to that incredible market share that they have. So I think a lot of companies are going to absorb those costs, perhaps not everybody, but I think in the end of the day, the effect of those tariffs are not going to be as pronounced as people felt. And also you saw it because initially, remember Trump was saying, I'm going to do 30, 50, 100%.
Yeah.
And now it kind of seems to be, settling in around that 15% level. And the other thing is, the president is quite right. For the longest time, our markets, people could come here and sell as much as they wanted with minimal or practically no tariffs, okay? And, we're in a different situation now. The United States of today is not the United States in the post-World War II era where we were the 800-pound gorilla of the world. We manufactured everything. We were the economic engine of the world because the rest of the world was devastated. After the World War. Now things have changed, and a lot of the U.S. manufacturing base has left. One thing, if you give me a second just to mention, I remember back in the 90s, there was a gentleman who ran on an independent ticket. A guy named Ross Perot, guy with big ears, you couldn't miss him, right?
Gave the
from
win
Texas.
to Bill Clinton over Bush.
And he basically, he said, that was a time that they were discussing these free trade agreements. And part of his pitch as an independent candidate, he says, trust me on this. When those free trade agreements are signed, you're going to hear this enormous sucking sound. And that sound is going to be the sound of U.S. jobs, manufacturing jobs going overseas. And the guy was absolutely right. And we lost a lot of automobile manufacturing, textile manufacturing, all sorts of things that were produced in this country. They went streaming out. And quite frankly, a lot of U.S. multinational corporations, GM and Ford, they joined the bandwagon. Why? Because they looked at China and they saw, wow, man, this is 3 billion people, tons of young people entering the workforce every year. This is the market of the future, and we want to go and sell F-150s in China, and we want to go build plants over there. All the computer companies wanted to reduce their costs and go over there. All this stuff, it all flowed in that direction. But guess what? Didn't work out so well for those companies, for those multinationals. Why? Because they found out that dealing with the Chinese was very, very difficult. Because yes, they would do joint venture agreements, but they would take that technology, they would start, creating competitors to them in China. And then the other thing that happened is, we lost an enormous amount of those jobs in the U.S. We didn't have an industrial policy to, re-employ those people. We just assumed, And I did, quite frankly. I was sorely mistaken. I admit that. That, well, it's capitalism. Things will eventually work out. Those people that lost their jobs will find other jobs. Guess what? That didn't happen. Why? Because labor really isn't as mobile as we think it is. People that grow up in a small town in North Carolina and have worked in the textile industry their whole life are not going to turn around overnight and go to Silicon Valley and become software engineers. The same for coal miners in West Virginia. People are wedded to their local communities. And we didn't do, as a country, a good enough job of saying to ourselves, what are we going to do when we lose all these jobs, right? And so now, we've paid the price for that in terms of losing our manufacturing base, become a service economy. In essence, that's the bulk of the things. I mean, we have a fraction of the manufacturing base we had before, and now we've also, through a series of just horrible mistakes, we've accumulated this incredible debt. It's not the same thing. We are not the big, powerful country that we once were, a half a century ago, 75 years ago. Things have changed dramatically.
I think we've only seen a glimpse of the impact, a very minor glimpse of what the tariffs could do. Again, you mentioned the revenue coming in. So your point of view is one that this will play out in a very positive manner. There are those who are critics to it. Is your prediction that if this does play out, even beyond a Trump presidency, you believe future Republican presidents, possibly Democrat presidents, would keep these trade deals? Would the sort of new norm when it comes to the U.S. way of trading be the one that Trump is establishing now, or would somebody else maybe shift it?
Look, I think they will. And in fact, the Biden administration left in place some of the tariffs that Trump had put on China, right?
Yeah.
Because he saw the amount of revenue that was coming in, and Democrats love to spend money, but they also, they're not ignorant of the fact that we have, taken on way too much debt in this country, right? So I think whatever Trump is doing right now is going to be in place for quite some time, particularly if, J.D. Vance, becomes the future candidate or Marco Rubio, whatever. I think they will keep those policies in place. I think we don't have the luxury of just, opening our doors to the rest of the world, whether it's for, commerce or whether it's for immigration as well, right? Migration, that's been another problem. Our doors have been opened, right, for trade. And we simply cannot afford it anymore, not with $36 trillion in debt.
Yeah, very much so. I think the topic of immigration will be interesting in the scope of economics, because we need to reform our legal immigration system, and which President Trump himself has mentioned. He has, I think, a very good understanding, not just of everything from seasonal visas, but high-skilled visas, agriculture. I mean, he's talked about the need for these reforms. Again, there's been a focus on the border, very much well-deserved and needed. But I do see, my prediction would be that next year we will begin to see a little bit more of a conversation coming out of Congress, possibly pressured from the president, for legal immigration reform, because they do help. They come alongside Americans. We've seen it year after year. Frank, I want to ask you a little bit about, and you mentioned in your previous answers, the role of sort of trade when it comes to the politics of this year, of next year, of 2026. I mean, I want to hear a little bit more of your prediction. Do you think that this is the area where the president will be able to do a big victory lap? We're not seeing, we've only seen a glimpse of the impact. Next year, we possibly might be seeing a little bit more of that. And does this, and this is my main question, is the topic of trade the one that solidifies that new generation of Republican voters? I'm talking specifically about the Rust Belt. When we think of places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, these states for so long were considered strongholds by Democrats. I mean, I can't remember the last time that a Michigan or Wisconsin went to a Republican prior to President Trump. They swung back for Biden, but then they swung back for Donald Trump. These are the new swing states. Is the fact that the president is focusing on trade, trying to bring back American jobs, or even these possible checks through the revenue coming in, do you think this is the topic that kind of solidifies the Rust Belt for Republicans?
I'll give you an interesting fact about elections in the Rust Belt states. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan have voted together since 1991, I think. They've never voted different, right? They always voted in a block. Somehow, some way, these three states, since the 1990s until now, we're talking about almost 30-some years later, and some political cycles along the way, have always voted together. That means the sentiment of these three states, it's not coincidence, usually during election cycles are about the same. So we can say as one of these three states go, the other two will go. And if we use this scenario as an example, that means the Republican Party is taking a look at the Rust Belt states, especially President Trump and all his cabinet and his future members that are going to run in, the follow up of what will be the MAGA movement without President Trump. That will be an interesting thing to watch. Also, they're looking at is also from this political standpoint, right? J.D. Vance comes from a Rust Belt state. He's from Ohio. He has a great backstory, an underdog story, addiction in his family,
Yeah.
poor upbringing, low economic income, to what he became a patriot, a senator, a young, fresh face for the Republican Party, and now vice president of the United States, a heartbeat away from the presidency. That is a really nice story and a very proud story of the American dream, of what you can achieve in the United States. So obviously, as him as a heir apparent of the MAGA movement, or like the first one in the polls, you got Marco Rubio also there because of merits. He's done a great job as Secretary of State, and now you see him looking around as a possible ticket in the next general election. I think this is a very important thing because obviously the Rust Belt states, especially those that I mentioned, do vote on economic issues most of the time. It's not international politics. It's not geopolitical stuff. It's sometimes not even migration because it doesn't affect them that much. It is economic issues. So obviously, when you see Trump bring in $300 billion in revenue because of tariffs, and if you see also uh, Trump talking about reciprocal tariffs, but as a Trump way of explaining things, right? When he says, look, motorbikes imported from India to the United States get a 2.4% rate, a tariff on this importation for motorbikes from India to the United States. But India, in the other essence, when it imports US made motorbikes, it imposes more than 90% tariff. So that's why Trump is calling on reciprocal tariffs, right? Not the US to be outsmarted or outplayed by this international. It could be also friendly allied countries, but you have industries, and Raul I think could dig a little bit better on this on the economic side of the technical side of it. You got the steel industry that is very important for the Rust Belt states, right? They're called Rust Belt for a reason. You got the steel industry that is a very competitive with China. China, most of, if not all of its steel industries, is subsidized by the U.S. China, the U.S. The Chinese Communist Party was the only party in China. That means the steel prices of Chinese steel is so low and it's artificial that it's impossible to compete within any market that is balanced and fair. So obviously the U.S. steel market has no chance against the Chinese steel market, and it also that provides obviously inside the country a loss of a lot of jobs, especially in those states. So to answer that specific question, it will not come down to the question of tariffs. It will come down as a whole economic package and planning. Does it pan out really good?
Mm-hmm.
Is inflation low? Are my grocery prices low? Is the big beautiful bill not adding more to the debt because you're balancing it out with the tariffs,
Yep.
right? People will not go into depth on an economic talk, but they will see it as a very general thing to see. Are we getting ripped off by other people, or are we balancing it out? Okay, if we're balancing it out, then that's a friend, right? That's not an enemy. That's not someone who's seeing my face and saying, I'm going to take advantage of you.
Yeah.
Is my prices of housing, groceries low? And do my kids will be better off than me in the future? That's the basic questions. And I think based on those questions, in November of last year, people saw President Trump as delivering that. And I think that will be the most important thing in the next elections. Now we have to see the midterms. It depends on how Congress really behaves, and also the president behaves. If he brings also peace into these wars that are going on internationally, that also adds to his playbook of being a peaceman, a man that resolves, a man that gets things done, and that will really do well with the electorate. So yeah, in the end, I think it will be a combination of a lot of things.
Yeah.
But the advantage the Republican Party and Trump has, just to finish, is that when you look at what the Democrats have, they're still talking about gender bathrooms. They're still talking about, stupid laws or legislation about woke ideology. They're not concentrating of what the people's issues are, and that is the main problem. That is the Democratic Party of today, which is sad. And but the Republican Party has a lot of young people to promote that are really concentrating on the issues, and now President Trump delivering on them.
Yeah, and the leader of Democrats, or at least one who has received the major headlines lately, has been Mondami in New York. A self-declared socialist who's laid out essentially a socialist, some call a communist agenda for New York. So I think Democrats, when it comes to this topic, haven't necessarily stepped up to show the American public what their economic agenda would be. I do want to turn for our last segment before we finalize. Is a little bit of on international news. And Frank, voy a seguir contigo. I'm going to continue with you. Latin America, the neighbors of the United States, among several of our trade partners and allies in different areas, but it's also home to places like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. Bolivia specifically has been a country where for the last 20 years, the same socialist party has had a grip on the government. However, in the last few days, they did come out of essentially a runoff. In other words, there will be a runoff where two of the candidates can be called center-right in the context of Bolivia. This is welcome news to a lot of people in the country and welcome news to a lot of people in the region. What is your prediction, one, of what will happen, not just in Bolivia, we do want to hear that, but not just in Bolivia, but what impact would this have in the region? Would this be a loss for places like Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, and would this be a gain for the United States?
It will be a definite loss for the socialist international political platform like the Forum of Sao Paulo and the Group of Puebla that have been members of the most radical left wings in Latin America, highly linked to narco terrorism around Latin America. It's not a coincidence that recently the U.S. has upped its ante on Maduro's information that leads to his capture to $50 million. And we've seen also what militarily has done off the shores of Venezuela. Something is coming, something is being cooked on the way. Secretary Rubio has a lot to do with that. He knows these topics too well. He's a very fine Secretary of State, I think, and I may say, you can quote me this later on in the years. I think Marco Rubio will go down as the best Secretary of State of the last century. He's been a guy that has been really good on managing international politics in every aspect. People said, "Oh, he's only good in Latin America. Or he's only good on this type of issues." He's been good on every issue and everywhere he's seen. So Bolivia obviously just had elections. And for the past 20 years, it has been governed by the same party, the Mas party. It's a socialist radical left-wing party that has doomed Bolivia into being considered a point of importance for narcotics, basically because of the la coca. Is one of the plants that is used to make cocaine and other type of derivatives of drugs. And now, for the first time in 20 years, a whole generation has passed since we have two candidates that are, we can consider better and more democratic, and will be, if enough pressure is applied, will be more inclined to be allies with the United States and other countries, neighboring countries. Yes, maybe one center right wing candidate, that's Tuto Quiroga. He was already president for a year. He was vice president for 3 years. He assumed the presidency on a resignation of the former president, but he was only president for 1 year. Then you got Paz, who is the son of a former president. He's been seen too cozy with Evo Morales, who was president for, I think it was 13 years in Bolivia. And he was like the most radical one. He was the one who did allies. Who had allies like Chavez,
Yeah.
Castro, and Ortega. So yeah, he's been too close with them in the past, and that is raising some concerns. But he's a guy that if you pressure him enough, I think he will have more an U.S. ally democratic agenda, which is good. So basically, what Bolivia said was no more socialism. They didn't even put one person in the National Assembly.
Mm-hmm.
Not one congressman for that movement was elected. Everybody was from opposition. 100% of the Congress now is 100% opposition. No one from the current government was elected. So it's a good sign, and it's a sign of, yeah, but after 20 years, right? Obviously,
Yeah.
Bolivia has faced elections before of fraud,
Mm-hmm.
and that we have to take a look at that. But yes, it is a good example for Latin America. Colombia is coming next year. Chile comes at the end of this year. Honduras comes at the end of this year. And all those three, the outcome that it projects is that center right to right wing governments will win those elections, obviously doing a natural shift in the ideological standpoint of Latin America
Yeah,
as a whole.
which would be a welcome news, not just for the United States, but for other countries that are looking for that region to be a little bit more stable, or to have governments that are a little bit more friendly when it comes to these conservative policies. We've seen the shift already in places like Argentina and other nations in Latin America. But I do want to move over to the Middle East. The war against Hamas continues. Israel, the strongest ally that the United States has in the region, continues in this battle. There have been news. President or Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has voiced the fact that Israel might be looking to take over the region during this war. They did say they would give it back then to another sort of Muslim or Middle Eastern Arabic nation. If I'm not mistaken, Raul, you were in the region recently. What is it, the news that you're hearing on the ground? What is the perspective that you come back with?
Well, I just came back, in fact, this past Saturday from an entire week in Israel. I'm very friendly with Chris Ruddy, who's the founder and owner of Newsmax Media, and he put together a team of people to go over there. I occasionally contribute to Newsmax, and had the opportunity to go over there. We met with President Netanyahu. We met with Prime Minister Netanyahu. We met with President Isaac Herzog. We met with the Speaker of the Knesset, Amani. We met with the Minister of Foreign Relations, Gideon Saar. We met with just a bunch of people, and we traveled the country from the Gaza Strip all the way up to the north, the very far reaches, overlooking Lebanon, overlooking Syria, and really got a very good feel for what was going on. Where we went in Gaza was actually the northern. We didn't go into Gaza. We were literally right on the border with it, looking into Gaza. There ain't a whole lot left. Okay, I mean, the place looks like the far side of the moon, quite frankly. Because that's where the Israelis first attacked from the north with bulldozers and tanks and everything else, and they before doing that, they told everybody flee to the south, because they kind of told people this is where we're going, right? So get out of the way. And sort of the takeaways that I came away with from this visit are, first of all, for anybody that's listening to this podcast, all your viewers. If any of you have an interest in going to Jerusalem and seeing the holy sites and visiting Israel, now is the time to go. It may seem, kind of silly,
chaotic,
but it really is, because if you think about it, Israel has basically, destroyed the Iranian nuclear program, right? They are going to be busy rebuilding that capacity, and rebuilding their conventional military forces that took, a pretty big hit these last couple of weeks. Syria has a new leader. He doesn't really have control of the country anymore. The Syrian Air Force has been completely demolished. Their air defense systems are pulverized. In Lebanon, Hezbollah, which was closely aligned to Iran. Remember what happened with the pagers?
Yeah.
Israel went in there, bombed their senior leadership, entrenched in these deep bunkers, wiped out most of them. Now the Lebanese government is saying they're going to disarm Hezbollah. And then you have Hamas, which continues to hold hostages. This morning, I read that Netanyahu announced they're going to activate another 50,000 reservists. They're going to call them back to duty because they're going to build up their active duty forces again to basically clear out the remaining elements of Hamas. I think this war will be over by the end of the year, if not this year, if not early part of next year, for a very specific reason. Number one, they've got elections coming up in 2026. I don't think Netanyahu wants to be still involved in a war with elections around the corner. I think also the sense that I got is that, the Israelis themselves, I mean, if there's one thing that they're united about, and this is not negotiable, they want all of the hostages back and they want Hamas defeated. I mean, I think whether you're left, extreme right, center in Israel, that's what they want. And why? Because every single Israeli can identify with those hostages. Jews, Arab Christians, whatever, even foreign nationals, because look, they kidnap Thai farm workers, right? I mean, so everybody in Israel can identify with the hostages. They say, that could have been me. That could have been my son. And they're weary of the war because you need to realize that Israel doesn't have a professional military like we have here in the U.S., where we've got, millions of soldiers who make a career out of it, who retire from the military. Over there, the people that are doing the fighting are conscripts, literally, young men and women that are 18, 19, 20 years old.
Must serve.
If you look at all the deaths from the Israeli side, they're all very young people that have been, conscripted into obligatory military service, have gone off to fight. Then they activated their reservists, which, after you finish your obligatory service, I think you have like a 10-year reserve commitment. They've activated those folks. And on some occasions, they've actually brought back a lot of veterans because they needed additional, people with senior experience. That has caused, a lot of disruptions to the Israeli economy because if these people,
the
they were
labor workforce,
they were running a small business. Suddenly, you're spending 2 years, fighting in Gaza. You kind of like, your little shop that you had set up and you had high hopes for, is now collecting dust, and you're going to have to rebuild it when you come back. So there's a lot, I think the Israelis want the war to end, but at the same time, they want all the hostages back. Okay, there's very little debate about that, and they want Hamas eliminated because they realize you cannot peacefully coexist with a group who basically has this sort of culture of death and is seeking martyrdom, and they all want to be shaheeds. They all want to be jihadis, and they want their sons and daughters to grow up the same way. That is incoherent with a modern democracy like Israel that is multicultural, diverse. Give you an example. We met with the Speaker of the Parliament, right? So this guy is part of Netanyahu's extreme right wing, right? He served in the IDF for 6 years as a military policeman. He then served in the Shin Bet, okay, which is Israel's secret service, internal secret service, and then he ran for parliament. But he's also the first openly gay Speaker of the Knesset of Israel, right? So you can't, put that guy in a box and say, well, gee, he's like a right-wing, genocidal, maniac. No, wait a second, This is a guy who's, the openly gay first Speaker of the Knesset. He's part of Netanyahu's right-wing party. Yes, he also served in the military. He served in the Shin Bet, That is reflective of Israeli society. I mean, it's very different. And the other thing that surprised me, quite frankly, was seeing the number of young people on the streets of Israel, young couples, I should say, with 4, 5, 6 kids in tow. The average age, I think, in Israel is like 30 years old. It's a very young society.
Yeah, very young demographic.
They've got an incredible, high-tech industries that are growing very, very quickly. And I hope this war ends because, we also went up to that border with the Golan Heights. We visited a Druze community up there where 12 school children had been hit by a Hezbollah rocket, which came from Iran and killed these 12 beautiful kids, ages 6 to 12, right? And obviously, there's been a lot of killing on the Arab side as well in the Gaza Strip. Just like we've seen a lot of killing in Ukraine, man. I mean, and I think Trump is absolutely on the right course. We got to find a way to put all this stuff to an end, and we need to sort of work cooperatively in the world to grow our respective countries and our economies. And we should be competing on the battlefield of ideas We should be competing in terms of commerce.
Yeah.
Okay, but killing each other is not really going to help anybody at the end of the day, right? I mean, we need to find a word. It's a very small globe, and we kind of have to put that stuff behind us, man. I mean, we can't continue to fight each other over religious issues, geographic boundaries. I feel slighted because you're maltreating my Russian minorities in Ukraine, whatever excuse you might have, man. We need to find a way to resolve those problems. I think Trump can and should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize when all this is over.
Yeah, a key fact that the end goal is to end these wars.
Yeah.
It's something that I think that almost all folks can be united on. I want to thank Frank Ali joining us from Tegucigalpa for his analysis on today's show. Raul Mas here in studio. Thank you as well. Thank you for joining us today on The Game, the show where we go play by play, analyzing the game of politics.